Here we are again, another week of social distancing. Boy, when this thing first started, I thought a couple of weeks and then we'll be back to normal. Boy, was I wrong. Well, we're in chapter 20 of Luke. Jesus is in the temple teaching the people. It's Passion Week, and he's receiving a lot of resistance from the religious authorities, as you might expect. So let's jump into chapter 20 and see what we can learn. Well, Jesus is teaching in the Temple Mount when he gets accosted by some religious leaders. They wanted to know by what authority he was teaching. Now, Jesus did what he often did. He answered a question with a question. He asked, John's baptism, where did it come from? Jesus was kind of playing a trick on them, but once again, the question was the answer. He knew that if they said that John's baptism was from heaven, then he could ask them why they didn't believe it. But if they said it's from men, they might be stoned because the people held that John was a prophet. And so the answer to their question was, my authority is the same as John the Baptist. We get it from God. But they decided to play it safe and plead the fifth. We don't know where this baptism came from. And so Jesus said in the sense that if you won't be straight with me, then I can't answer your question either. Goodbye. All right, after his run-in with the religious authorities, Jesus told a parable, and a pretty biting parable it was. He talked about a man who planted a vineyard and then rented it to some tenant farmers. Now the man went away, as is often the case when you leave tenants to run your farm. But at the end of the season, he sent servants to get his share of the crop. But these tenants decided they didn't owe the owner, and so they attacked and misused the servants. Now, when we look at this, I think it's God who planted Israel in the promised land, and he expected them to proclaim his goodness to the world. When they didn't do that, he sent his prophets to try and straighten them out, but they attacked and often killed the prophets. And so finally the parable tells them that the man sent his son, believing they would respect his son. But as it turns out, the tenants saw an opportunity to enrich themselves and get the inheritance, so they killed the son, as just in the same manner as which they will later this week kill Jesus. And so Jesus says, what will the man who built the vineyard do to these tenants? Well, he's going to kill them and throw them out. And that got the people's attention because they knew what was going on. They knew that Israel was the vineyard, and they knew that Jesus was saying that they were going to be evicted. And so they said, certainly not. But Jesus asked them, well, what is the meaning of this? And he quotes the Psalms. The stone the builders rejected has become the cornerstone, or the capstone, depending on your translation. In other words, something that was rejected, Jesus, would be the most important part, and they wouldn't understand that. So they rejected Jesus. And unfortunately, that meant that the Jewish people would be rejected and cast out of the promised land, as would happen in AD 70. The religious leaders knew that Jesus told this parable against them, and so they looked all the harder for a way to kill Jesus. All right, hopefully you read verses 19 through 26. The religious leaders were looking for a way to discredit Jesus so that they could get rid of him without causing a riot. Now they came up with what they thought was a tricky question. They asked him, what do you think about paying taxes to Caesar? Their hope was that no matter how Jesus answered, he would be put in a bad place with somebody. If he said, don't pay taxes to Caesar, then the Romans were going to be after him. But if he said paying taxes to Caesar was good, then the common people might reject him. Either way, they hoped that Jesus would be discredited. But Jesus saw what they were trying to do and asked them to show him a denarius. He said, "Whose inscription is this?" They said, "It's Caesar's." So then he answered classically, "Render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, and render unto God what is God's." So we're to give to the ruling authorities the respect they're due without um, without forgetting about our allegiance to God and our religious duties to Him. And so Jesus saw through their problem and came up with an answer that didn't get him in trouble. All right, so we're looking at verses 27 through 40. Well, the first people up had asked their trick question and failed to stump Jesus. These people were probably Pharisees, I'm guessing. So the Sadducees thought it was their turn. Now Luke offers an editorial for his um, Gentile audience who probably doesn't know that the Sadducees don't believe in the resurrection. That's always kind of intrigued me. What kind of spiritual life would you have if you don't believe in the hereafter? Well, I guess it's all about this life and living comfortably here, which is, from what I understand, what the Sadducees did. Now, they asked Jesus a question from the law. In the Old Testament, if a man died and he didn't have any children that were going to take care of his wife, his brother was supposed to marry his wife and have children to take the place of the ones that his brother failed to have before he died. And it's a practice kind of to be a welfare for widows so that they would have children to take care of them. Now, the Sadducees tried to use this as a trick because they brought this scenario where one brother died and left a wife, then his second brother, third, and so on, until finally the woman herself died. So they asked Jesus, whose wife would this woman be in the hereafter? Which they didn't believe in anyway. Jesus told them, however, that they didn't understand. The people that are found worthy of the resurrection will neither marry nor be given in marriage. And in fact, they cannot die. They'll be like angels. Now, he said like angels, not that we'll be angels. Like angels, I think, is the idea that we'll no longer die. We'll live as spiritual people in heaven. Now, Jesus then takes to the story of the burning bush, and he says, God said to Moses, I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Well, Jesus drew from this that God is not the God of the dead, but the living, that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob were with him in heaven. So he's telling the Sadducees that they really didn't know what they were talking about, that there is a heaven and that people who die are alive with God. So after this, the teachers of the law, probably the Pharisees, said, well said, teacher, because they liked the fact that the Sadducees had been stumped. But after that, everybody gave up trying to stump the band. They just couldn't get Jesus tricked by their questions. And so they stopped with that tactic and looked for a different strategy, which Judas will soon provide. All right, hopefully you read from 41 to the end of the chapter. Jesus digs into a little theology here, and it's getting a little deeper than some of the other. He asks them a question. How is it that the Christ can be called the son of David? By son of David, he's implying that he is a descendant of David. And he's asking, how can this descendant of David be David's Lord? See, he's trying to teach the people that he's not just human, which he is, fully human, but he's also fully divine, which most didn't understand at that time. And that's how he's called Lord, because he is God in the flesh, the second person of the Trinity. Now, Jesus also went on to tell the people to beware of the teachers of the law, for they like to go around and flowing clothes and showing off, being recognized as rabbi, making lengthy prayers, big lofty prayers with lots of what might have been the equivalent of King James English in it, showing off. But at the same time, their hearts were cold to God, and they could devour a widow's house without thinking a second thing of it. Well, Jesus says about these people who go around making lofty prayers and then doing bad things that they will be punished most severely. Boy, I wouldn't want to be in their shoes. It makes me want to pay attention to how I live my life as well, trying to live the walk and not just talk the talk. And I think that's a good advice for all of us. And that brings us to the end of the chapter of chapter 20. I hope you enjoyed the teaching, and I hope you think about what Jesus is trying to tell us and how he wants us to live. See you next week.